The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
This is where we're helped, I think, by African American literature, because at its core, it is asking the sort of question: how do you live in a society that has a history in which things are built around you not being able to be free? And by thinking through those things, we realize the emphasis on the body, the emphasis on embodiment, the emphasis on flourishing and freedom, it actually links back in to what God has designed for human beings to really operate within.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Claude Atcho is a pastor in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the author of Reading Black Books, How African American Literature Can Make Our Faith More Whole and Just. As Josh Larson has said, this work of Christian literary criticism is written with the passion of a book lover and the urgency of a preacher. In this episode, Claude and I visit some of the great works of 20th century Black literature. We talk about a kind of theological reading that goes well beyond empathy. We also discuss what it means to acknowledge the image of God in another person, among other things. Claude Atcho, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today. Thank you for being here.
Jonathan, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So your book is Reading Black Books, and you make a big claim in the subtitle that African American literature can make our faith more whole and just. So I'd like to start there, give you a chance to, that really summarizes your thesis for this book, that African American literature can make our faith more whole and just. How so? How does that work?
So, part of what I'm doing with the subtitle and what I'm doing with the book as a whole is really drawing on African American tradition, both Christian and otherwise, which looks at the lived experience of African Americans and says that there is trial, suffering, and challenge that has come our way through unrighteousness. And a lot of times that unrighteousness is tied to what Frederick Douglass calls sort of the opposite of Christianity proper, this sort of perversion of the Christian faith. So by kind of inverse, working back from Douglass's observation, there is a true and peaceable and proper Christianity that is possible. And I think one of the ways we get to that is actually by looking at African American experience through our literature, seeing the ways that people grapple with suffering, seeing the ways that people hold on to hope in the face of extreme adversity not just created by their own poor choices, but through systemic powers and through people visibly and viciously against them. When we look at African American literature in these sort of ways, we see a corrective to many different sort of abuses, but we also see humans grappling with the essential questions of life, life under suffering, life under trial, and in the midst of those things, we find writers and characters who are grappling with questions of theodicy. Where is God in suffering? How do you keep going when the world is truly and literally against you? These sort of things, if we enter into the story and the literature, because it's dealing with human experience, if we read it in a certain way, it will draw us into the truths of the kingdom and will be refined through that process.
Now, some of the writers you talk about in this book are Christian people, and some aren't. You say that reading theologically doesn't require that the authors you engage be Christian or have a theological agenda one way or another. And I think also it's fair to say that reading theologically, it doesn't mean that you are necessarily there to criticize a writer who is not Christian, or that's not your main job as a reader,
right?
To sort of, tell what's wrong with this worldview because this person's not a Christian or whatever. Talk to me about how you engage theologically with books that don't share your theological commitments?
So Richard Wright's work, I think, is a really great example of this. I cover two of his books in my book. So he takes the crown in terms of getting two titles in one book, Native Son, and then The Man Who Lived Underground, and would certainly commend both of those to listeners. It was fascinating and penetrating and important works. But he's a great example. So in the story of Native Son, he is exploring the sort of doomed fate of a young black teen in Chicago in the 40s by the name of Bigger Thomas. And in that novel, Wright is really interested in sort of systems and sort of the way society has positioned itself in strong opposition to any sort of life of hope or flourishing for Black people. And he really highlights that through Bigger's experience. And so when you read that story, though Wright is not a Christian, he's interested in these sort of questions of agency, suffering, possibility. Is there hope or is there not hope? Right? Because he's engaging with human story, it can be read theologically, which means we can look at human experience and human story the way we would listen to our neighbor when they tell us their story. Yeah. We would listen for these clues that say, okay, what is there in this person's experience that is teaching me something about how human beings relate to God, need God, ask questions of God, shake their fist towards the heavens, right? Anytime we hear story, we can listen for those sort of cues, and it can help us to think better as disciples and as Christians. So that's how I think you can read theologically when we come to literature, even if the author is not necessarily engaging in a Christian project, they're engaging in a human project, which therefore means it has relevance to the Christian story.
Yeah. That's great. You said something. I think this is just an introduction that really surprised me, and it's not self-evident, let's say. So I'd love to hear you explain what you mean when you say theological reading demands that we do more than empathize. And you go farther than that. You go ahead. You go so far as to say that a properly theological reading demotes empathy from the sort of one of the main points to a happy product of reading. And I would have thought, I'm a white person. A lot of my listeners are white people, and I would have thought one of the big reasons to read African American literature would be to empathize. And you're saying you're looking for something to happen that's more than empathy here. So I'd love to hear you explain what you mean that you want to demote empathy.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on this. So I think empathy is obviously really important, and it is a really key product of art, particularly literature. Right? When we read, we're doing, we're being quiet, and we're engaging and submitting to the words of another, which is in the world that they've constructed, which really does not happen in any other sort of context. Where we just sit and submit to these sort of words. So I don't mean to undercut the importance or power of empathy, but I do want to sort of order it properly, and kind of, if we're thinking of sort of steps of a ladder. I really do like what Martha Nussbaum, the literary scholar, says about literature, that it does create these links of possibility and these sort of bonds of empathy. I think that is really important. I think what a theological reading can do, at least in my view, and what I'm trying to do in my book with this project, is saying that there's a way to read for a higher goal that will still give us empathy, but then will push us further and deeper. So I don't want to discard it, but I do think a reordering is necessary. Empathy, I think, sort of focuses on how we can relate to the person we're reading. A theological reading really kind of terminates and ends with questions of God. So that's really what I'm after, is not just sort of, oh, how can I relate to Bigger Thomas? But I want to know, what does Jesus say about Bigger Thomas? What does Jesus say about this sort of experience? What does this teach me about God and his world, in which I fit, but in which I'm not sort of final or ultimate? That, I think, is really the big difference. So I give the example in the introduction of Bigger Thomas, where, empathy would be sort of like feeling bad for him, wondering how should I live differently to not participate in systems of injustice? How can I relate to this sort of character and understand what they're going through? Have my imagination and heart expanded through entering their experience? All obviously really important things, but we need to move further into sort of consideration of what word does Jesus speak to someone like Bigger Thomas, right? Mm-hmm. To someone who has lived this sort of existence. And what then do I need to think about when it comes to God and his relation to this world in light of this story? So it sort of moves past just how can my heart be expanded to actual questions relating to God.
Yeah, you shoot for the theological and you get the empathy thrown in.
Exactly. Yeah, that would have been the quick way to say it. That's right.
You spoke about expanding our hearts, our imagination again, but you're still talking about that as a byproduct rather than the main point. Is that's
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think along I think, to me, I think when we read literature in the way that I'm proposing, I think good things should happen to us. But I think it should also lead us to contemplate God and the story of redemption, the story of salvation, which obviously we're inside of, and we're attached to, and we're a part of, and we're benefactors of. But it's not just us. So I see those things really threaded together. So for example, and maybe some of it's the preacher inside of me, along with the sort of literary minded person inside of me. Some of these chapters that I've written, they have the sort of sermonic close or pace to, where I've tried to unpack how we ought to be different because of these stories, but then I also try to get to okay, a theocentric, Christocentric kind of conclusion as well, right? So it's not just enough for us to think differently about systems and structures because we read Richard Wright theologically. Mm-hmm. We also need to think about how God considers systems and structures in light of reading Richard Wright theologically, and what that means when we think about redemption and salvation and sin and grace and all these sort of things. So I think that's sort of maybe an inclination that I have, a conviction that I have, that it needs to be both of those things sort of in lockstep. And otherwise, I think we will sort of we'll be overwhelmed, by the changes that we need to make in and of ourselves, and we'll find that we'll run out of stamina to really live in a whole and just way. We need to keep God central to those efforts. Yeah,
that's good. Thank you for that. Also, it seems to me you're talking about, you've been framing empathy in terms of a sort of individual approach to, like, my heart expanding, me as the reader, and the theological reading is inviting us into something bigger than the individual. In the same, when you talk about sin, your chapter on sin, you get to this idea, you hit it pretty hard, the idea that sin is not just a matter of individual, making good choices. You're individual, but rather, this and Black fiction seems to be stronger on the idea of systemic sin as a systemic matter. and a communal matter, communal might not be the word I'm looking for, but something bigger than the individual. It pushes against the individualistic view of sin and salvation that prevails in so much of American Christianity, white American Christianity.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a good example of sort of how reading in the way that I'm proposing does expand our understanding, right? Does expand us to now think about, okay, if sin operates in these ways, are there places in my life where I'm actually sort of caught in this hive mind, this sort of web of sin, in ways that are really quiet, in ways that are actually pretty respectable and sort of just totally normal, and none of us bats an eye at, with this understanding, we would all have to say, absolutely, that's the case, and and with this sort of understanding, there's no sort of groveling that has to come with that. There's now freedom to recognize, if that's the case, then I need to be aware. How can I become aware? How can I make these sort of changes? One great example of this, all these insights for me in terms of they have a scriptural basis, but their literary basis comes from, again, Native Son by Richard Wright, where Bigger is being helped by the character Mary Dalton and her boyfriend, who have very sort of radical politics and sympathy toward African Americans to see them as equals. But even in their sort of goodwill, they don't understand the system that they're in. So their goodwill ends up putting Bigger in positions and places that he has no preparation for how to respond, and it ends up sort of cascading a tragedy that, in my reading, is both related to systems and then also the choices that happen within them. So that serves as a small example of kind of, if we read the story kind of with ears attuned to some of the theological themes, then I think we're led into a way in which our hearts and empathy is expanded, but our theological thinking becomes a little bit sharper in the process as well.
Yeah, that's good. Why do you think people are resistant to the idea of systemic sin? I mean, as you said, there's something is nice isn't the wrong word, but the idea that as I acknowledge that I'm sort of in this web of systemic sin, dealing with it is not a matter of groveling and feeling sufficiently bad about it. Whereas in terms of individual sin, there is a measure of feeling bad. Why are so many of us so resistant to the idea of sin as system?
I think that's an important question. I mean, I wonder, maybe the most general, I like with these sort of questions, I like to try to think about what's the most generous reading of a situation. I think maybe the most generous reading of why people are afraid of systemic sin is that people, out of a desire to be faithful to the whole truth of the faith, don't want to see individual sin and individuals' need for grace to be sort of undercut or overthrown, right? So if I was going to try to think in the most charitable way, I think that does exist in some places. But I think, we also have to be realistic too. I think there's sort of there's a lot of fear that comes from embracing a view of systemic sin, because if our systems are broken, then we're going to have to reimagine a lot of things, and that's going to change a lot of things. And change is frightening for most, right? So I think there's sort of a fear in some of that resistance. I also think there's people have not seen good examples of how these truths go together, and they're complementary and interconnected. You're not displacing one for the other, right?
You're saying you're not displacing individual responsibility for sin for systemic.
Correct. Yeah. So I think people they think in extremes with new ideas, or with ideas maybe that are new to them, and so they go in that direction. But I think another reason people my anecdotal read is that folks who have not seen or experienced sort of sin at a group level, at a structural level, they they don't see how these things can be held together. And I think that's why it's a lot of ethnic minority traditions, at least in the American context, that are able to recognize both the individual reality of sin and a social systemic nature. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's our lived experience that opens us up or closes us apart from recognizing, I think, the two angles of sin that Scripture speaks of.
Yeah. Okay. I would love to talk about the image of God, because you talk about an idea in your book that I wasn't familiar with, and I don't think it originated with you, but
no.
The distinction between the structural element of the image of God and the functional element of the image of God. And I don't fully understand that distinction. I'm going to get your help here, but I do think that, from what I understand, I am guilty of overemphasizing the structural side of things, which does sort of you argue, and I think you're borrowing from Hokema. How do you pronounce his last name?
I think that's how I've said
Hokema?
it. Yeah, Anthony Hokema. That's how I've said it. So maybe we're both wrong.
You're right. But we end up emphasizing the human capacity in disembodied ways when we pay too much attention to the structural rather than the functional, at the expense of the functional element of the image of God. Now, I just said all that, but what we really need is for you to explain the difference between structural and functional elements.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Hokema is helpful here. That's what I'm citing and kind of working from. So this idea of the image of God, that we're all made in God's image, meant to reflect Him. And Hokema is helpful here because he talks about the image of God is kind of has two sort of components. The structural, or the structure, which is kind of like our gifts, our capacity, so our rationality, our creativity, our relationality with others. And then there's also the functional piece, right? What we're meant to do as image bearers, right? So these are our the use of the God-given gifts in our structure, right? That we're given a creation, a cultural mandate to cultivate creation, to image God, to worship God, all that sort of stuff. So it's really this kind of like gift, capacity, and then sort of like job or mission, right? That's another way you can think of structure and function, which really doesn't originate with him. It goes back to church fathers who said we're made in the image of God, but we need to grow in the likeness, right? We need to cultivate the virtues so that we can fulfill the function. I think what's important here, all of that said, it can be simplified by recognizing that in a lot of American church circles, we think about the image of God as the capacity to be rational, to think, to create, to know who God is. We think of that sort of capacity and that structure in those terms. Those are very good and very important, but we don't think about what it means to be an image bearer of God when others are actually doing bodily harm to your existence. We don't take all of those pieces of the doctrine, structure and function, and make explicit connection that they're linked together and they're embodied in human flesh. We don't deal with the sort of visceral reality that what it means to image God is to actually live in the physicality that we've been given. And because we don't think about that often, we don't have a question, or we don't have an answer rather, to the question, what does it mean to image God when other image bearers are trying to stop you from imaging God, right? They're actually trying to hold you back from living the life, worship, cultivation, creativity, flourishing that God has made human persons to live. This question is very much taken up by African American literature because it's a question of freedom, right? It's not even a question that necessarily Christian writers, Black Christian writers, are required to ask. It's anyone who is a Black person writing or thinking in the American context is asking this sort of question. So this is where we're helped, I think, by African American literature, because at its core, it is asking the sort of question: how do you live in a society that has a history in which things are built around you not being able to be free? And by thinking through those things, we realize the emphasis on the body, the emphasis on embodiment, the emphasis on flourishing and freedom, it actually links back in to what God has designed for human beings to really operate within.
So the structural, everybody agrees that everybody of any race, any ethnicity bears the image of God. Like there's no debate about that. Everybody agrees.
We do now. Yes. Yeah.
Right. We do now. Right. But that's not enough. Your point is that's not enough for us to all agree that we all have the capacity. The question is, do we have the opportunities to live out the image of God? That's the difference. Is that another way of summarizing the difference between?
Yes.
And so I don't necessarily need to congratulate myself for acknowledging that people of all races and ethnicities and nationalities and creeds bear the image of God. I also need to ask, in what ways am I contributing to anything that's preventing them from fully expressing that image?
Exactly. Yep. And all this is linked into Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man, and it's a really important novel because in the novel you find Invisible, the main character, is not given a name. He's sort of a stand-in for the everyday African American. Novel came out in 1952, one of the best 20th century novels that we have. And in this novel, Invisible, the protagonist sort of moves from place to place, trying to find a way to live a life of dignity, what we would call in Christian terms, right? He wants to image God, right? He wants to make a contribution to the world. He wants to know that he's valued, right? Which is also part of knowing that we're made by God, that we have value just in our being, irrespective of the good that we've done or the bad that we've done. We have value. He's looking for this, and he doesn't know how to get it. So he turns to education. That turns to be a dead end. He turns to work and activism. That turns to be a dead end. He turns it to movement in deep and radical politics, and he thinks he's made it, and he finds out no, he's actually viewed as a pawn even within that context. And because of all of these things, he ends up in the underground, looking at society from the outside in, and sort of at a distance from all other people. And you sort of realize, if you look at that theologically, what he was looking for was a place to have an embodied recognition of his dignity as an image bearer of God. And at every turn, he finds rather that he is treated as an embodied sort of tool to be used for various ends and means, while maybe feeling good about himself along the way. He's never actually recognized as for what he truly is in the category of the Christian story, right? One who reflects God himself. So when we follow Invisible's journey, we realize that when he's sort of being used in political activism, they recognize him for his gifts of oratory and rationality, but they don't recognize him as a true embodied human being, right? And that's the place, right? That's the rub, because within that movement that's called the brotherhood, all people are recognized as being equal. All people are seen of being of worth, but it actually doesn't translate to the real lived reality that he experiences. And I think that's where Ellison's novel can really push us to say, okay, we affirm finally, right? We affirm the true doctrine about people's dignity, but are we working to see this happen in an embodied and lived way? That becomes the real challenge and opportunity before us.
Yeah. Good. All right. Before we run out of time, we've got to talk about Margaret Walker and her poem "For My People," which you build up to that. That's the last chapter. You spent a lot of time on that poem, and it's such an incredible poem. And I was hoping you'd read some of it. And
absolutely.
And then we can kind of talk about. Yeah, let's talk about it after you. So this is the poem's actually 10 stanzas. You're not going to read 10 stanzas. You can tell me what you're going to do.
Absolutely. And I encourage folks for folks to go and to read this. If you search on YouTube, there are many different writers that have read this poem. This poem means a great deal to many, not just in the Black community, but of all different backgrounds. So I encourage folks, you really do need to enjoy this poem in its entirety. I'll read a couple of the first stanzas, and then I'll read the last two.
Okay, thanks.
For My People by Margaret Walker. For my people everywhere, singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people lending their strength to the years, to the gone years, and the now years, and the maybe years. Washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sand of Alabama backyards, playing, baptizing, and preaching, and doctor, and jail, and soldier, and school, and mama, and cooking, and playhouse, and concert, and store, and hair, and Miss Chumby, and company. And now I'm going to skip down to the last two stanzas of For My People. For my people blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and clubs and societies, associations and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, preyed on by facile forces of state and fad and novelty, by false prophet and holy believer. For my people standing, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves and their countless generations. Let a new earth arise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control.
Wow. I love that that vision of a new heavens and a new earth, or at least a new earth there at the end. This vision of hope. And I know you do too. I mean, you write very beautifully about it.
Yes.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad to speak on that a little bit. I think one of the things I think is important about this poem, as I mentioned, encouraging folks to read the whole thing, consider it sort of, the way I read it is it's sort of telling a whole story. And so you can sort of see this movement of history, this sort of panoramic view of African-American experience, highs and lows, triumphs and trials, all these sort of things. And then we get this movement in this last stanza, right, from description of for my people, for my people, for my people, to this petition, this call down, right? Let a new earth rise, let another world be born. This almost comes out of nowhere, right? And I think that does embody this theme of hope that I find so compelling in this poem.
Coming out of nowhere, you say, that makes me think about the way Fleming Rutledge talks about the sort of apocalyptic vision that redemption is not it in some sense does come out of nowhere. It's not the logical conclusion of what has been happening, but rather it comes from outside.
Yes, I love that observation. And I think there is a way to really read this poem in that sort of sense, because of the language is very apocalyptic, a bloody peace written in the sky. It's also paradoxical, right? Bloody peace, right? Let the martial songs be written, right? And we're calling this new kind of world, right? Okay, so how is this new world going to be brought in by war songs, right? I think that fits perfectly into a sort of apocalyptic understanding of salvation, that God is making this rescue that comes at the darkest hour outside of us, but still comes to us nonetheless.
Yeah, you make the point that hope. You said black hope is rooted in the faith that the God of the end time is also the God of the present time, and that seems relevant to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think that timepiece is really important. I think that sort of realizing that hope really is eschatological. And through some of this chapter, I'm drawing on J.D. Otis Roberts, who has some really great insights about this. And I think it's really important in sort of part of the Black Christian traditions or tradition is really this idea that the God who owns the end time, who will judge all and will establish perfect righteousness, he's also the God of right now. Even though things are chaotic and painful and difficult, if we can trust that he's going to judge in the end, we can trust that he'll carry us through in the present. And I think it's that thread that moves from the end time to this time. It's that thread on which hope stands, right? That hope is strengthened. Our ability to trust in the God of the end time leads us to endure in the present time, right? And it's not that we sort of trust out of nothing. We have these sort of anchors of trust, right, through the work of Jesus and his cross, his resurrection, his word, all these sort of things that strengthen that bond of end time hope that bleeds into present time reality.
Yeah. Who was it you in the epilogue or the epigraph to that chapter, you quote somebody, now I can't remember who, said, I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus rose again from the dead. Did I get that right? I don't know if I said that right.
You did. You did, yeah. That's floated around. That's credited to Leslie Newbegin when I did all my work on that. And I think that really does capture the difference. You know what we're talking about when we're talking about hope related to the Christian story. It's not what I call a thin hope. That's just sort of like, well, I sort of hope everything will work out, right? And it's also not this sort of other version of thin hope that says, hey, everything's just going to be great. You know, it'll all be easy. It's a different category of hope, right? It is a sort of apocalyptic hope that God reigns, God rules, God has invaded, God has come near, and God will arrive again. And on the basis of that, we have hope in the midst of circumstances in which hope under sort of normal categories really should not exist. That I think is when we're getting to the real basis of Christian hope. Otherwise, whatever we're hoping in is the thing that we're trusting in. So in light of 2020, there's a lot of, I think of Ta-Nehisi Coates, a writer I really enjoy, who began to have hope in seeing sort of a racial consciousness coming to arise in our national conversation, and which really reveals that his hope was in the sort of could white brothers and sisters get it together. And now that he sees them getting it together, well, now I can have hope, right? Yeah. So everything was really riding on them, right? And I think that's just too much to put on any of us. So our hope has to come from something else, something greater than just sort of new knowledge, new action from our own brothers and sisters.
Yeah. I remember Miriam McKibben Dana, who wrote a book called, I think, A Handbook for Hope, I think. She was talking about there's a columnist that she likes to read his interpretation of whatever sort of disastrous events are in the news, because he always offers a hopeful vision of what's happening. And one of her friends said, "Well, what's his track record? I mean, is he usually right? As it turns, is he usually proven right in this hopeful interpretation?" And she says, that's not the question. Because it is an orientation. Hope is an orientation. It doesn't say if your positive predictions are correct, therefore your hope is justified, but rather I'm oriented towards something that ultimately is going to be true, and is only. I mean, we're still on the not yet. It's not.
That's right.
Or we're still on the now, I guess I should say, and the not yet is coming.
Yeah, that's right.
You say that. Hope is the opposite of naivete. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that's some of what I was just trying to touch on a little bit. That it's that hope is really based in hard situations, right? We need hope when we know we need hope most when things are bleakest. Yeah. So that's actually the conditions for hope. Yeah. So when we're hoping is in those situations where we're real enough and honest enough to say, this is horrific. This is not the way things are meant to be. And I think that's what you see in Walker's poem, right? It has a real honesty and a real historical awareness of what her people have gone through. And I think that's how we know we're getting close to true hope, because there's an honesty, there's a historical awareness, there's a real sense of understanding things are not as they ought to be. Therefore, we must look beyond ourselves, outside of ourselves, for any semblance of hope.
Yeah. How do dirges and the blues and slave songs relate to the kind of thick hope that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it loops right into what we just mentioned about this sort of the nature of hope containing real honesty, And I think it's actually the truthfulness of our experience. If we can reckon with that, we become primed to move closer to hope. So I find that Walker's poem shows us that hope has a sort of historical dynamic, the sort of dynamic of honesty, and it also has this sort of eschatological dynamic, this sort of what we talked about earlier as a sort of apocalyptic theme that we can pick up on the last stanza because we, read Fleming, Rutledge, and these different sort of thinkers. I think hope has both of those dynamics, this sort of honesty about what we're in, and then this gaze that goes further. So that's where I think the slave songs and the dirges come in. It's through that ability to vocalize the truth of our real experience.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's talk about. I love the way you talk about the last stanza or two. I guess it's the next last stanza when Margaret Walker starts talking about all the Adams and Eves, right? She's expanding the idea of who are my people. She's still talking about Black folks, but there's also an expansion beyond. That my people are not just my community, defined in a narrow way. Can you talk to me about that? This idea of expanding our notion of who my people are.
I think if we look at this part of the poem in a theological reading, as I kind of proposed through my chapter and through the book, I think we're really helped and we're guided really well by some of what the poem is doing here, because this is an unexpected term, right? Throughout the poem, we've been conditioned almost rhythmically to expect another continuation of "for my people," "for my people," and then here we get all of a sudden, okay, "for my people," who are actually trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves. So what Walker is showing us is some of what we hear from Dr. King and the beloved community, that we are tied together in this mutual garment of destiny. And this drills so deep and so close to the truth at the heart of the Christian story, is that we are made in the image of God, and we do belong to God, and we do belong to one another. And what we need to begin to understand is that we all have this sense in which we can say "my people," but at the same time, that's connected to which we are called to say "all people." And that dynamic is extremely important. It's a reminder of what we're given also by grace through Christ and through our salvation. Think of 1 Peter 2, where we're told, God says to those who were not my people, "You are now my people," right? So now our idea of who our people is expanded by the knowledge that the God, the good creator, the triune creator, has actually made all of us in his image. So in that sense, we are all his people. And then in another sense, our idea of who our people is no longer tied around ethnic lines exclusively, but rather now tied around the lines of Christ's very body, right? This all people, this "my people," is now expanded through the borders of our redemption in the body of our Savior. So we get these layers of who our people are redefined by the truth of God, our Creator, and also the truth of God, our Redeemer, which now begins to change how we hope. We don't just hope for my people, but for all people. Changes how we serve, how we love, how we care, not just for my people, my place, but for all people in all places. And those are gifts and bonds of hope and community that God gives to us. And I think this poem is really pointing and showing the way that's both inspirational and also instructive.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate your devoting so much time, a whole chapter to this poem, because it's such a beautiful poem. I've loved it for a long time, and I really appreciated your
Thank you.
Deepening it for me. All right, let me ask you one last question that is my typical last question, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Oh, man. So in a real sense, everybody that I cover in this book, but I'll certainly highlight Ralph Ellison as one. He really taught himself to write, and he worked really hard. He sort of copied Richard Wright to the point that Richard Wright said, "Stop copying my stories." Like, you got to figure out your own stuff. But I really admire that he worked extremely hard, studied the great Russian novelists, studied the Bible, and he really wanted to prove himself. So Ellison, Ta-Nehisi Coates as well. I really really enjoy his memoir about his growing up with his brothers and his dad, called The Beautiful Struggle. I found that just extremely powerful. So I would offer those two. I'd also say Toni Morrison. Those would be kind of the three that I think of, and I say, one day I could kind of do something like that. So those are kind of my top three.
Invisible Man is one of those novels that I've always think I'm going to get around to, and I've never read, but after reading your book, I'm going to go read Invisible Man. That's the next thing on my list.
And if you dabble in Audible book, I think Lawrence Fishburne recorded the recent audio book of Invisible Man. It is long. It may, in some sections, hearing that read aloud would be just extremely powerful. So I do offer that to you as you take your Ellison journey. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Claude Atcho. This has been great. Yeah, absolute pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate you.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.